Senator, thanks for coming. Glad to have you here. Welcome. There's a major discussion in Washington right now over executive power and over the balance of power between the branches. You've contended, and you did in our op-ed this week, that the president is lawless. I wondered if you could talk about what you mean by that, and also acknowledge the president's argument where he says that he's acting on his own because the Congress isn't doing anything. And if you look at just the number of bills passed, you could argue that that's true.
Sure.
So what's your counter argument?
Well, first of all, if you take a look at Obamacare, I mean, that was a law passed. It was a law that he and his supporters, Democratic supporters in Congress, wrote and they passed, and he's not following the law. My particular lawsuit was selected, or the issue for my lawsuit was selected because I really, and I still believe that I can show and prove specific harm, which is what you need to do to get standing to have the president's unconstitutional executive order. In this case, it was a regulation by the Office of Personnel Management challenged in court and overturned. So I mean, that'd be the first point. If you want to talk about the lack of productivity in Congress, the House has passed literally hundreds of bills. Where they're dying is in Harry Reid's Senate, and I'm not totally up to speed on the number of amendments we've had in the last year, but I know for a year, from July 2013 to July 2014, I think we had votes on a couple more amendments. There were only 18 roll call votes on amendments in the United States Senate over a year's time period. Now, the Senate's supposed to be the world's greatest deliberative body. We had, as Republicans, 11 roll call votes on our amendments. The Democrats only had 7. Now, if you take a look at the House chamber, which is really a majority-run chamber, there's really virtually no rights for the minority in the House. The minority rights were really about the Senate. Take a look at Robert Byrd in terms of his respecting the institution and minority rights. House Democrats, I think the number in that same time period is exceeded 170 votes on their amendments. And that, by the way, is how you debate in Congress. It's really not getting down the floor, and although there's some of that, a verbal exchange. It's primarily through a committee process. Generally, the best way to do it is in a committee and a markup around a table like this, where you have Republicans and Democrats actually discussing a piece of legislation, putting one on the table, offering amendments to hopefully improve the legislation.
By limiting amendments, that's limiting the debate.
It's decimating the debate. I mean, it's totally eliminating it. And by the way, it's one of the reasons Congress is so dysfunctional. This is just like business. When I would sit down and negotiate a contract, I wouldn't start immediately arguing. I would spend a lot of time on the front end figuring out what we agreed on. By doing that, you actually develop a relationship, develop a level of trust, so when you got to those areas of disagreements, it was a lot easier finding common ground. Same thing would happen if we actually utilized regular order in the committee process for working and developing pieces of legislation. We would actually be at a table like this, talking to our Democratic colleagues, offering amendments, hearing the debate. Where it actually is it's a lot easier to debate when you're sitting across the table and, well, here's the amendment. What's the purpose of that? And we've done this in my 3 years. We've really only had what I would consider 2 relatively robust committee markups. One was our budget process, when we actually did pass a budget in the Senate, the only time, and then the markup on the postal reform bill. Other than that, we've just had some very perfunctory types of...
So is the system at fault, or are both parties, the personalities in both parties at fault? How do you change this?
Well, I would say in terms of the Senate, it really is Harry Reid at fault. If you really respect minority rights, if we were really running pieces of legislation the way they should be run through regular order, starting with the committee of jurisdiction, let that committee debate, offer amendments in a markup, then pass those pieces of legislation out of committee, put them on the floor of the Senate, allow those pieces of legislation, now that have been marked up and passed through the committee, have a full debate on the Senate. In other words, a full amendment process. But what Harry Reid has repeatedly done is, this is inside baseball term, but it's called filling the tree. He takes a piece of legislation, very few have actually gone through the committee process. He'll just drop them on the floor of the Senate, kind of bypass that regular order, then he fills the tree of amendments, and it's kind of take it or leave it.
So it was different when the Republicans controlled the Senate.
It has, pretty dramatically. This is dramatically different. Again, I've never served in a functioning Senate. I got here under Harry Reid's rule, but certainly as you take a look at any kind of metric in terms of number of amendments debated and voted on, we have dramatically reduced that. And again, that is the way you debate these pieces of legislation. And from my standpoint, I think even Democrat senators are pretty, I think, frustrated with the process. I mean, you're there to represent your state, your constituency. The way you represent them is on a piece of legislation, being able to offer amendments that reflect, in many respects, in many instances, the wishes of your constituents. That's how you represent people. If the only thing you get to do is a take it or leave it vote, up or down, yes or no, it's really not a very deliberative process. And again, it's created so many hard feelings and really certainly exacerbated the dysfunction.
Can we return to the executive power debate for
Sure.
a minute? I think a lot of people look at what you just described as fractiousness and just see politics. But you're arguing, again, in the op-ed you wrote to the Journal Sentinel on Sunday, you're arguing that there's something more fundamental happening
Right.
here. What is going on that you think voters need to know about?
Well, and this is on a bipartisan basis. We certainly, during my lifetime, I've witnessed an expansion of executive power and authority at the expense of the legislative branch, and that threatens our democracy. If, and this was actually quoted in the opinion of Judge Griesbach, if you vest all power, legislative, executive, judicial, in the hands of a few or one, I mean that really is the definition of tyranny. And our founding fathers really set up these three. It was a genius framework of three co-equal branches of government that were really meant to check the expansion of powers and preserve our freedom. And that's our constitutional framework. And if one of those branches continues to get more and more powerful at the expense of the other, it really does threaten our freedom. And we're seeing it today. And if this isn't just out of my words, self-described liberal law professor Jonathan Turley has been testifying before Congress. And he's describing the current situation as a constitutional crisis. He said, we're at the tipping point. And he said, this president in particular has crossed the line. But again, this has been happening over decades. As presidents of both parties have continued to expand their presidential power at the expense of Congress. So now where we're at is the executive really basically holds all the cards, the vast majority of power. Jonathan Turley describes the executive agencies as the fourth branch of government. Take a look at Dodd-Frank or Obamacare. Those really aren't tightly crafted pieces of legislation that really lay out, here's the law. What you can look at those pieces of legislation is more as a framework for the regulatory agencies to write the law. I'm not exactly sure on the word count, but I believe it was Obamacare was 380,000 words. I think Dodd-Frank was 350, or vice versa. I use words because pages can be, depends on how many words you can get on a page. So 350 to 380,000 words, both those two pieces of legislation. Dodd-Frank now is up to 15 million words. And by latest count, they've only written about 40% of the regulation around that framework of a law. Obamacare, I think, is up to 12 million words. And you can see how powerful the executive branches, the regulatory agencies are. And I would argue that really threatens our freedoms. When these are unelected bureaucrats, you don't have the input from your elected officials in terms of what a lot of these regulations are and how they affect real Americans' lives.
But in a complicated bill like Dodd-Frank or Obamacare, how would you do it any other way?
Well, first of all, you try and keep things simple. I'm not sure we need such complex bills.
Okay.
One of the things I've argued, if we could just get rid of the word comprehensive out of the lexicon in Washington, I think we'd be better off. There's really from my standpoint, there's no reason of doing all these comprehensive, these massive bills that are hundreds, if not 1,000 pages or more. It adds complexity. I come from the big business world. They've got a basic principle called the KISS principle: keep it simple, stupid. Okay. I think we'd be far better off if we would try and simplify the issue. We've got a problem, do a root cause analysis. That's one of the things I'm always talking about. Veering off a little bit to debt and deficit is the first step in solving any problem is you have to admit you have one. Then you have to properly define it. I have a manufacturing background. I've done a lot of problem solving, done a lot of root cause analysis. That's the type of thing we really ought to do. And, I would say Dodd-Frank utterly misdiagnosed the problem in terms of the housing bubble. The political class pretty well left itself off the hook and immediately attacked, other factors for causing that, when really, from my standpoint, what caused the housing bubble was Washington, Congress, pretty well threatening banks with prosecution if they didn't make loans to people who couldn't afford them. Not a real good idea. That created the housing bubble. It burst, but the reaction was Dodd-Frank. By the way, those were two individuals that pretty well juiced the housing market. They're the ones. Barney Frank said, let's just roll the dice on home ownership. Well, they rolled the dice, and then I've always described having them write the reform to fix the problem. It's kind of like asking the arsonist to put out a fire, and they haven't fixed the problem.
So who should be jailed? Who should be jailed? Dodd-Frank or the bankers?
Who should be in
jailed? For the housing crisis. Dodd-Frank or the bankers?
I'm not an attorney. I'm not a prosecutor. I don't know what laws may or may not have been broken. I think the primary.
I mean, you're letting the banks off the hook for this.
No, I'm not. I'm saying the primary problem with the housing bubble was the fact that Congress, through the regulatory power, forced banks to pretty well get off the tried and true method of having a significant down payment, really taking a look at people's ability to pay off loans. I mean, they were calling them liar loans. They went down.
Congress instituted liar loans, or the banks instituted liar
loans? Congress pretty well forced that on banks. They wouldn't allow people to what they call redline. They threatened prosecution. And so lending standards were pretty well thrown off to the side. Fannie and Freddie were the backers of all those loans. And bankers, by the way, when you set up a regulatory framework where you don't hold the loans that you make, and that was through regulation. We created that system where banks made the loans, didn't ever worry about whether people could pay them off, because they just sold those off into Fannie and Freddie or into mortgage-backed securities. So again, that was a regulatory framework that created that problem. Sure. Did banks take advantage of that regulatory framework? Yeah. I mean, you have to argue whether they took advantage of it. How many banks went bankrupt? The people that were really involved in that process, they no longer exist. I mean, Wachovia is no longer here. Countrywide financing didn't work out too well for them either.
And on back to the other thing you're talking about on executive authority, the members running for Congress, I believe in your district, all of them support the impeachment of the president. Do you back that?
That's not true.
That's in the sixth. You're in the sixth or the.
Yeah, no, I'm the 6th district. You're saying the candidates running?
Yeah.
First of all, I'm not aware if they made those statements. I've tried to concentrate on what we can accomplish. That's simply not possible. I've just answered an earlier question. Do you think we're going to, try and move forward with any kind of impeachment? I say no. We're not going to. It's not going to happen. It's not going to. Okay. It's just not going to happen. So I would much rather focus on something that is something we can accomplish. And the reason I decided to move forward with my lawsuit is, like I said, even the judge who dismissed my case because of lack of standing, and I disagree with his ruling on that, but I appreciate the careful consideration he paid to it, and I appreciated him writing the opinion that he did that highlighted how important the case really is, what the merits of the case really are. My case was dismissed on a legal technicality, so we're going to appeal that legal technicality to the 7th Circuit so that hopefully we get judicial review of what I think is a clear-cut case, where Congress passed a law, actually specifically voted whether the federal government could make an employee contribution to those plans that were supposed to be purchased through the exchange, and the president, without the legal authority, because there's nothing in the Constitution that grants the president the authority to either enact, amend, or repeal laws. I mean, the president's duty, he shall take care that laws are faithfully executed. I'm trying to get him to faithfully execute the law. And again, this isn't fuzzy at all. Congress actually voted on an amendment to prohibit the federal government from making employee contribution into those exchange plans. In the exchange plans, and then OPM said, hey, let's pretend the federal government's a small employer so they can buy in through these shop exchanges, which the law says you can make an employer contribution. Again, contrary to Congress's express wishes, an express vote that employer contribution shouldn't be allowed. So I'm just hoping that my case gets its full hearing in court so that it actually gets ruled on based on the merits of the case, which highlight this president's unilateral governance, which is a real threat to our freedoms and our democracy.
Why does Congressman Sensenbrenner say this is a waste of time? What would you say to him? A waste of time and money for what you're
Well, it's interesting that Congressman Sensenbrenner did vote for John Boehner's lawsuit trying to obtain legislative standing. I can't really speak for the congressman on that standpoint. All I can speak to, for myself is this is not frivolous, it's not trivial, it's not a stunt. This is a very important and serious constitutional issue that I think it's well past time that the courts have got to get involved in this discussion, this debate about the separation of powers, because things are not co-equal anymore.
So he just doesn't understand it? Is that why he's calling it a stunt?
Well, Congressman Sensenbrenner, as many members of Congress, trust me, this lawsuit was not popular among my colleagues because they were looking at the implications. If the federal government would make that employer contribution to those plans, members of Congress would have to use their budgets, which are generous, and they'd have to probably maybe pare back a few staff members to be able to boost some pay so that you can kind of make something that the people that remain whole in terms of their overall level of compensation. For my own part, I've always underspent my budget by at least $500,000 because I knew what was coming down the pike. One thing really weird about congressional budgets for their offices is it only is the salary. It doesn't include the benefits and the retirement pay. So the members of Congress don't even have a clue, the vast majority of them, of how much benefits really cost in relationship to salary. So I'm sure, and he talked about this, that there'd be a brain drain. I don't believe that's true. I think Congress could definitely get by with fewer staff members. It might make the place a little bit more simple. We maybe wouldn't be talking about comprehensive things as often. So I just have a fundamental disagreement with them on this issue.
You keep on saying that's a legal technicality, but they threw
standing
out that you failed to demonstrate harm, which is not a legal technicality. That's a fundamental rule to keep the courts from being flooded with a bunch of litigation.
I understand, and I respect that. But again, I disagree with the judge's ruling. Let me tell you. Let me tell because and my legal team took a look at the opinion, and they really think there's some real avenues we can go down to again make the case so that his ruling is overturned. But from my standpoint, it's pretty clear cut that there is harm, and here's probably the most egregious.
No, I understand your point on that. I was just saying you keep on saying that that's a legal technicality, but that's a hurdle. Pretty large hurdle to prevent the courts from being overwhelmed with cases. Maybe you think there should be more litigation.
We can quibble with the term. The point when I say legal technicality, I want people to understand that my case wasn't tossed out because based on the merits of what the lawsuit really is. It never even got the merits of the case. The president's unilateral governing, his overreach, this ruling that lacked the constitutional authority to do so, that is not what was on trial. What was on trial was whether or not I had proven to a sufficient degree that I could show specific harm to gain standing. So, again, we can quibble with the term legal technicality. I think that's all we're doing is quibbling with the term. The substance of the fact is the substance of the case has not been overturned. It just hasn't been heard, and all I'm asking is for my day in court.
Bill asked you about the race in the 6th congressional district. I haven't heard. Who are you voting for in that race?
Oh, it's a secret ballot. I don't get involved in primaries. I don't think it's really. I don't think I have any business in trying to influence that. I've let the candidates in the vast majority of primaries make their case to the primary voters and let the primary voters decide. I think that's more appropriate. I mean, I'll cast my ballot, but I would do that.
You have someone you like, right?
I probably like all of them. I'm not going to select one over the other. Let's put it this way: I will definitely be fully supporting whoever wins the primary against the Democratic opponent. And to a certain extent, that's one of the reasons that I don't want to involve myself in primaries. I would hate to have somebody I've selected not win the primary, and then the person who does emerge from the primary potentially be marginalized with intact, well, Senator Johnson, didn't like you over that person. So again, I don't think it's really my role. I don't think it's my responsibility. I think it's just.
You could frame it any way you want it. I mean, you could frame it right now. I like all three, but I'm going to choose this particular person.
Well, I could, but I'm not.
But you were saying it would be interpreted as I like this one, I didn't like this one. I was saying it doesn't have to be that way.
Listen, again, I've got a great deal of faith in the primary voters and the Republican primary to make that decision themselves, and I would be fully supportive of whoever those voters choose. Obviously, I'll be voting in a secret ballot for the person that I would prefer out of the three people, but I'll be happy with of any of those.
Can I ask you about a state race that's going on, the governor's race? The Republicans are attacking the Democratic opponent as Millionaire Mary, I guess for being too rich. What do you think about that? It's sort of a turnabout.
I would prefer they not do it.
You would prefer they not do it.
I think one of the harmful parts of our politics right now, and I think it's not helping recovery, is that far too often in the political realm we demonize success. We demagogue against it. What we should be doing is we should be incentivizing success. I really thought one of the best things that Governor Walker did was, upon winning the election, one of his first statements was, "Hey, Wisconsin, we're open for business." I think that's a powerful statement. From my standpoint, the solution, the primary component of the solution of all these fiscal issues, and I would argue cultural as well, is we have to have economic growth. Now, how do you get economic growth? Well, first and foremost, you have to make America or Wisconsin or Milwaukee an attractive place for business risk-taking, investment, business expansion, job creation. How do you increase people's wages? Get a robust economy where businesses have to compete for labor. That's a sustainable increase in wages. So how do you incentivize that? How do you make your jurisdiction attractive if you're demonizing it? It's very dispiriting for people that are taking risks. Business isn't very easy. It's not easy coming up with a product or service that other people want to buy. It's even more difficult providing that product or service at a cost that is less than you can actually sell it to. So it's the reason I don't have a stat on it, but most businesses are not particularly successful or they outright fail. So from my standpoint, I think we ought to be celebrating the success of those businesses that do succeed, and we ought to be doing everything we can to incentivize it and help them.
The other 2 points in the race that are business related is that the company, her family's bicycle firm, has been criticized by the governor's campaign for outsourcing. They've also been criticized on taxes. They don't pay any corporate income tax, but of course they're an S corporation, I believe, like yours was.
Right.
So where are you on those two issues, outsourcing and attacking her for quote unquote not paying?
Outsourcing is one of those, one of those areas of demagoguery, quite honestly, and demonization of businesses. I was a manufacturer, and my manufacturing company is still churning out product. 80% of our customers were here in the U.S., but we exported to about 20 different countries. We were the sole source supply for some, I won't name the companies, some pretty large businesses, very, very well respected. Real feather in our cap. It's hard to be a sole supply. It shows you that how good you are, the level of integrity you've got. It was very frequent, because we only have one manufacturing operation, that some of those large companies would come to us and say, well, it's kind of risky for us, because if this operation goes down, tornado, whatever, how are you going to supply us? Also, a number of these multinational companies were producing or setting up operations overseas, and there was a lot of discussion. We'd like you to follow our manufacturing overseas so that you can source our product close to where we're actually going to be manufacturing or selling it. And so there's all kinds of reasons for wanting to open up operations overseas, to take advantage of markets, to maintain a relationship with an important relationship that's domestic based, but also support their expansion. So I don't want to demonize it or demagogue against it. The fact of the matter is, free trade overall, free but fair trade, benefits everybody. It really does. If we start becoming more protectionist, it's going to really harm our economy. It's going to harm the development of the rest of the world. And we really want the rest of the world to develop, because the fact of the matter is, people from around the world value American products. And so oftentimes when a company starts an operation in someplace overseas, they may be taking advantage of lower labor, but a lot of it's manufacturing to be shipped back over here, where you have a distribution system set up, you've got salespeople, there's a lot of jobs created. And there's some studies showing that for every job that's supposedly outsourced, you may be creating 2 jobs here in America. I'm not saying that's absolute across the board, but the fact of the matter is, there's nothing wrong in opening up operations overseas. We shouldn't demonize it. It's actually quite beneficial to America.
And on this S corp situation,
well, if you really want to take a look at the corporate tax, one thing you have to understand is that it's not the piece of paper that's the corporate charter that pays the tax. There have been a number of economic studies that show, and somewhat disputed, but I think it makes sense, that the people that pay the corporate tax are the employees of the business and consumers. You really want to take a look at it. The corporate tax is a self-inflicted wound on our economy. Very counterproductive. We can talk about inversions and some of these other pieces of legislation, trying to really mask over our very uncompetitive tax system. But the fact of the matter is, if let's say you're talking about how do you make America an attractive place for risk-taking and business investment. If let's say you're a multinational foreign-based company and you want to come to America to manufacture close to the largest market in the world. And that's a big advantage we have. We're the world's largest market. Trust me, as a manufacturer, you want to be close to your customer. Are you going to site your manufacturing plant in Toronto with a 15% corporate tax rate or Detroit at 35%? I mean, where would you do it if it was your money at risk? Well, the problem we're having in America is we have an uncompetitive tax structure, and so more and more companies, multinationals, who would love to manufacture in America, because then their closer customer are choosing, I can't afford to do it. Because not only is the tax system uncompetitive, but so is the regulatory environment. Do you realize it costs $1.8 trillion per year to comply with federal regulations? And let me put that number in perspective. Only 10 economies in the world exceed $1.8 trillion. That's the burden that we're putting on our job creators in terms of running a business. And then throw in an uncompetitive tax system, it's no wonder that our economy is kind of having a hard time growing the way it really has its potential to grow.
In a specific race, should Trek be attacked because the Burke family and others are paying the taxes through this subchapter S?
No. That would actually be one way of addressing the corporate taxes. Rather than make customers and employees pay the corporate tax, why don't we make the owners? And that's really what a subchapter S and LLC structure does. Now, trying to convert that system into large corporations is pretty complex. It gets pretty complicated, but I think that's a pretty good model. I mean, you got to understand. I don't know. I have no idea what their tax situation is. I'm just responding to LLCs and subchapter S's in general. Okay, that's a pretty good system, because what you end up doing is that business tax then is taxed at individual rates. And I'm not a real supporter. I don't like a progressive tax system by and large. I'd rather have a flat system. I think it's fair. But if you like a progressive tax system, that's the perfect way, I guess, to tax corporate profits, because you're taxing those at progressive individual rates.
And just so I understand, your corporation, which you're still a part of,
it was an LLC.
It's an LLC, and then so you pay a personal.
Yeah, those business, and let's call them business earnings, get directly attributed to the shareholders. And so, it's fully taxed. Whatever the earnings are of the business flows through. They call them flow-through entities. So that income flows right through to the shareholders, and then the shareholders just tack that on to whatever income you've got, and based on your income level, you're going to pay at that progressive tax rate. So it's not that the corporation's escaping tax, it's just that the income is escaping. It's just being flowed through and paid at the owner level. I think that's a better model. I think it'd make us far more competitive if we were able to figure out a way of taxing all corporations at the shareholder level. I think that's one of the solutions.
So do you think the Republican Party and Governor Walker should lay off on these three issues?
I think there are far better areas to address. And from my standpoint, we ought to be talking about, I'll repeat myself, how do you make Wisconsin a more attractive place for risk-taking, business investment, business expansion? And so you look at, again, conceptually, this isn't real hard. And what you have to look at in terms of making yourself more competitive is pretty basic. What's your tax system? I've traveled around the state. I've talked to multinational corporations that choose not to expand in Wisconsin because our individual rates, for example, for the managers they may want to bring in to run the operation, our individual income tax rates are too high. They'd rather go to Texas. You take a look at the regulatory environment. How welcoming. I think that's dramatically improved under Governor Walker, but we still have to take a look at that. So you take a look at your regulatory environment, you take a look at your tax system, and again, I think it's a pretty powerful inducement when at least you've got a governor who's saying Wisconsin's open for business, that he's overtly and very vocally trying to attract business. I think that's a good thing. And that's what we really ought to be doing at all levels of government.
On the corporate tax at the federal level, you've said at 35% it's way too high and it's not competitive. But the effective tax rate is nowhere near that. It's something maybe in the teens.
But you can't do it as averages. The effective
well,
tax.
It's not average. I mean that.
No, you're talking about overall effective tax rate, which is true.
Yeah.
But you've got very large corporations taking advantage of what I would consider very unwise subsidies for all the renewable energy and all these tax credits.
Sure.
Again, we're trying to use our tax code to basically economically engineer, to incentivize certain activity that the geniuses in Washington think we should be doing. Well, we're not very good at doing that. And so you do have large corporations that take advantage of those subsidies, and they can drive their effective rate very low, which affects the other averages. But there are plenty of businesses. We had a hearing in PSI with Caterpillar, a great company, doing exactly what we want companies to do. They manufacture primarily here and they export overseas, and I can't remember exactly their effective tax rate. It was below 35%, but it was still quite high. It was in the high 20%. They're paying basically those taxes. But again, if you take a look, are they better off continuing to manufacture in places like Wisconsin and Illinois, or would they be better off over time moving into a lower tax jurisdiction like potentially Toronto at 15%?
But to lower the actual tax rate, don't you have to close some of those loopholes and clean up the tax system? How do you do that?
Well, that's part of the problem in trying to work with our current tax code, which is just awful. I mean, it's incredibly complex. We're 70,000 pages. I don't know how many devoted to the corporate tax.
But as a political matter, how do you fix it?
So again, what I've been talking about is let's figure out a way with business earnings to stop taxing, punishing consumers and employees, but let's figure out a way to make the owners pay. And there's a number of alternatives for doing that. And I'm not the only guy talking about this. I heard Steve Ratner talk about this on Morning Joe a couple of weeks ago. How do you tax business income at the owner level?
Senator, a couple of years ago, Wisconsin passed this domestic manufacturing tax credit that is phasing out the state income tax for operations, I assume, like Packer, your business. Do you know if Packer took advantage of that and what the impact has been on your taxes?
So which one are you talking about again?
Well, the domestic production tax credit on ag facilities and manufacturing facilities in Wisconsin.
Yeah. Again, what we'll do is we'll comply with whatever the tax laws are. And even though my wife was an IRS agent, I literally have not done my own taxes since about 1979. So that's really what I hire people to do. So
taxes? You don't know what your business taxes are?
I don't know the specifics of which credits, and no, I honestly don't. And I'm an accountant. It shows you how incredibly complex the tax system is. I mean, I'll tell you, my tax returns. Remember that old computer paper, that really wide stuff, those boxes? That's what my taxes look like every year.
Hey, can we get back to the governor's race? Just listening to you, you sound incredibly like Mary Burke's criticisms of Governor Walker on these three issues that Bill raised.
Listen, I think Governor Walker's done a phenomenal job in the state. So I understand your, the thrust of your questions.
Well, I said on those three things, and in fact,
which is what you're concentrating on. Well, let's concentrate on the things that Governor Walker's done really right.
Well, he hasn't hesitated to suggest that you're a little too much gloom and doom, and that you need to be more Mr. Sunshine, as you've said. So I was just asking you.
You're not Mr. Sunshine?
Oh, I'm Mr. Sunshine, yeah.
That's how he's referred to himself on a couple of occasions now.
Let me turn into Mr. Sunshine. We'll talk about our 30-year deficit picture here.
So why do you think they are going after her for her personal success and for the company's success?
Again, you'll have to ask their campaign. Again, I'm just responding honestly in terms of what I think we should be talking about, what our thrust should be, and it's about how do you make Wisconsin a more attractive place for risk-taking business investment. I think that's what Governor Walker has been doing across the board. He really has. Starting out with the statement that I repeat all the time because it's powerful, hey, Wisconsin, we're open for business. That's the first step. Let businesses know we're going to be welcoming. Our system, Governor Walker comes into office with a certain structure right now. Here's the tax system. Here's a regulatory environment. And you don't fix things overnight, but you start moving in that direction. And obviously probably the most significant thing he did was how do we give localities, school boards, the flexibility so they can balance their budget, and that's what Act 10 is all about. And from my standpoint, pretty successful. we've been able to stabilize tax rates, which is one of those factors. If you at least keep your property tax rates from increasing, now again, you're looking at multinational corporations potentially coming to Wisconsin, taking advantage of really, especially in the summertime, a wonderful state in terms of environment, great workers. And now at least you can say, well, maybe your top tax rate's higher than other states, but you've at least got a governor and assembly and a state senate that understands we've got to get control over out of control government spending and out of control increasing property tax rates, and we stabilized that. And we stabilized things like tuition things. So there's all, again, this is hard. I mean, and when you come into office, you're dealing with what is currently in place, and you start incrementally move yourself in the right direction to make Wisconsin more attractive for the kind of economic growth and job creation that you can. And we're creating jobs in the state. It's a more welcoming environment. The state is far better off today than it was when Governor Walker took office, and I think that's the main takeaway, and that's why I'm so incredibly supportive of getting him reelected.
Did you, when he made those comments about you saying that when he hears you speak, he would like to slit his wrist, and things like that?
I don't think he said that about me. That's what I said. Around the state, I'm called Mr. Sunshine.
Everybody but you and he agree that he was talking about you. Okay?
Are you going to believe him or me?
Did you take anything away from that? He said that your message was too negative and it should be more reform-minded. Have you done anything to make any adjustments?
So let's talk about how you solve a problem. And again, in manufacturing, I've solved a lot of problems. We've all seen 12-step programs, right? What's the first step in solving any problem? You have to admit you have one, right? Then you have to properly define it. Okay, we collectively have not admitted to the depth of our problem here. I think just sort of generally one of the reasons people aren't feeling particularly secure is people realize this isn't sustainable, but they don't really know in real detail. And of course you have politicians lying to Americans all the time about not fessing up to the full extent of the problem. For example, how many times have you heard that Social Security is solved to the year 2033? Now I think they're changing the number to 2031. Well, it's not. One thing I've done in Budget Committee, I've been pretty relentless trying to talk to administration officials about admitting what they won't admit about the Social Security Trust Fund. It has no value to the federal government. Let me just take a little bit of time because this is important. People need to understand this. The trust fund holds about $2.77 trillion of U.S. government bonds. Now, that's an asset to the trust fund. Happy to admit it. But what's a U.S. Treasury bond to the United States Treasury? It's a liability. Now, Office of Management and Budget in their 2010 publication talks about this and says that the trust fund, yeah, it's there, but it pays benefits only in bookkeeping sense because you have an asset offset by a liability, and that transaction, if you consolidate the books of the federal government, nets to zero. That's in OMB's own publication, netting to zero. And in 7 committee hearings with Treasury Secretary Liu, Acting OMB Director Zients, nominee Burwell, OMB Director Burwell, OMB nominee Sean Donovan, those 5 individuals refused to acknowledge that fact. Only CBO Director Elmendorf and Fed Chair Yellen were honest enough to say, when you take an asset, offset by liability, that nets 2, and Fed Chair Yellen said 0, thank you. There's honesty. But as long as we've got politicians continue to lie to the American public, and oh, by the way, over the next 30 years, and that's really the definition of the problem, we don't have a 10-year budget window problem. We have a 10-year budget window problem, but that's not the problem. The problem is the 30-year demographic bubble. Over the next 30 years, Social Security, according to CBO, will pay out $14.6 trillion more in benefits than it takes in the payroll tax. $14.6 trillion. And again, to the federal government, the trust fund has no value. We're already cash negative in Social Security. We're already paying out more benefits than we take in the payroll tax on an annual basis. Have you seen this president talk about saving Social Security? By the way, Medicare is more than 2 times worse. Over the next 30 years, about $35 trillion more in benefits than we take in the payroll tax. Now, I realize Medicare, the payroll tax was never designed to totally pay for that, but President Obama, behind closed doors, by the way, I was one of those senators that had dinner with him, and then partly because of my prodding, trying to figure out what can we agree on, asked him to make his White House staff available so we continue to figure out what we can agree on to at least move in the right direction. But behind closed doors, President Obama talked about the primary driver of our debt and deficit. He said is healthcare spending, and from a federal government standpoint, it's Medicare. He said that the problem we have in reforming Medicare is that for every dollar that goes into the Medicare system, the federal government pays out $3 in benefits. And he kind of quietly leaned over and said, and most Americans don't understand that. Well, gee, I wonder why that is, Mr. President. Could it be because publicly the only thing I've ever heard, and I could be wrong, but the only thing I've ever heard the President ever say about Medicare is it just needs modest reforms. Now, an entitlement program that gets $1 in revenue, pays out $3 out in benefits, that over the next 30 years will pay out $35 trillion more in benefits than takes in payroll tax, I would argue, requires far more than modest reforms. But, and let's get to political demagoguery. When Paul Ryan offers, a reform, at least a partial fix for Medicare, do we discuss the merits of it? Do we really talk about how much of that $35 trillion deficit Paul Ryan's reforms would actually solve? No. What happens is Paul's political opponents produce a TV ad with a Paul Ryan lookalike pushing Granny off the cliff. Now, how are we ever going to get to real solutions? How are we going to really address these problems if that is the level of our political debate? And I think it's kind of inarguable. That is the level of our political debate, which would get me to, if you guys would like to discuss, I just held a hour-long, event through Cato Institute, where what I've tried to do is lay out this 30-year projection. Again, this was all based on my working with the White House trying to find common ground. So what we had done, because I asked my colleagues when we were kind of preparing for those White House meetings, how would we approach this? I said, well, first of all, we got to get America to admit we have a problem, then we have to properly define it. And one of my Republican colleagues said, well, we know what the problem is. We know what we have to achieve. And so what's that? So we got to get $4 to $5 trillion worth of deficit reduction. So where'd you get that from? Well, Simpson-Bowles. And I said, well, that's not the problem. The problem really is this 30-year demographic bubble. I mean, anybody know what the 30-year deficit's going to be? Nobody knew because we never talk about it. So we actually put together a projection over the next 30 years. Our result was $107 trillion over the next 30 years. I took that into the White House. I was sitting there, President Obama was sitting right here around an actually smaller table. When I had time to make my pitch, I said, Mr. President, you say you want everything on the table? Here's the way to get everything on the table for discussion. Let's go to the American public. Let's use your bully pulpit. Let's show the American people the extent, the real problem. I mean, the real demographic problem. And he looked at the numbers and said, Ron, we can't show the American public numbers this big. We'll scare them. I mean, they'll throw up their hands and give up all hope. And besides, Ron, we can't do all the work. We have to leave some work for future presidents and future Congresses. Now that's a little dispiriting when you've kind of given up a life you really love, going to Washington trying to fix these problems, and we've got a president of the United States that will not publicly admit the extent of the problem, and even behind closed doors says, I don't have the courage to show the American public the real problem. Now, since that time, we've expanded on our projection, because it's our projection, and it's a 30-year projection. I mean, it's only as good as the assumptions. So we've gone to some other authorities, and you always take a look at the Congressional Budget Office as being a budget authority. They actually do longer-term projections, but they don't do it in dollars where they're understandable. Instead, they hide the results, and I'm going to use that word because I think it's purposefully hid, cynically hid. They do it as a percentage of GDP. So actually, Pat, you may not realize, but Pat's a whiz kid now at spreadsheets and doing a lot of my budget calculations, working with the Senate budget staff and finance staff. We've converted those percentages of GDP to dollars. And so if you take a look at CBO's baseline projection versus their alternate fiscal scenario, their baseline shows a 30-year projected deficit of $66 trillion. Their alternate fiscal scenario, which I think if you look at the assumptions is probably more likely, is the path we're on, $127 trillion. And let me just lay it out by decade. The first decade, about $8 trillion. The third decade, $31 trillion. The second decade, $31 trillion. The third decade, $88 trillion. For a whopping total of $127 trillion. Now, to put that number in perspective, the entire net private asset base of America today, all assets held by every household, every business, large and small, is $106 trillion. That's the path we're on. And I've actually got, if you want to take a look at these things, you know, we've got the documentation. You can take a look at the White House projection, CBO. What's interesting, though, is just on all these projections, we've laid out the 20-year historic average percentage spending in GDP versus what the White House projection, which was way understated, by the way, CBO's baseline, our Senate projection, and the ultimate fiscal scenario. And you can see we're not, you know, in terms of entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, we're all pretty much in the same boat, but all of us are less than our 20-year average.
What's your take on the federal government's handling of the student loan debt crisis?
Well, it's been totally mismanaged. We have, as a federal government, enticed our children to incur now $1.2 trillion worth of student loan debt. $1.2 trillion. The average amount of student loan debt that somebody from a 4-year degree is graduating with is over $25,000. Depending on public or private, I think private schools closer to $29,000. We've also, within our university system, certainly pushed degree programs, and let's call them fill-in-the-blank studies program. I won't specifically finger any, that it's very unfortunate that employers aren't particularly rushing to take advantage of. You had a pretty depressing study out of Northeastern University that said 50% of recent college graduates are either unemployed or employed in areas that required no college education whatsoever. That's a real disservice we've done to our young people. And if you really take a look at it, you go back to the mid-'60s and you chart the cost of a 4-year degree over time. Had it just increased by, it was a little less than $1,000 in the 60s, 1 year, room, board, and tuition. Had that just increased by the rate of inflation, today college would cost, well, about a little over $7,000 for 1 year. Instead, we're close to $18,000. So the cost for a 4-year degree has increased at 2.6 times the rate of inflation. And I just ask people why. I mean, what's so different about what colleges and universities spend their money on that their costs would increase at 2.6 times the rate of inflation? By the way, room and board, two of those components, have actually, in the rest of the economy, decreased or increased at lower levels than the rate of inflation. So the cost of college has actually increased higher. I mean, the specific cost of college. But one thing that's changed is the federal government, with the best of intentions, and let's face it, you know, we all share the same goal of a prosperous America. We all want every American to have the opportunity to build a good life for themselves or family, and of course education is part of that. So we encourage that. So this is well-intentioned that the federal government got involved. They're just the wrong party to get involved in that process. They've thrown money at it. They've enticed our kids to take $1.2 trillion. So we've thrown money into higher education. The predictable and predicted result of that was the cost of college has increased dramatically in relationship to the rate of inflation. And we've actually made college less accessible because we've made it less affordable. So I mean, I realize that's kind of a longer-winded answer to your question, but no, I think we've done a real disservice to our kids, enticing them to get into debt. I actually had in my MBA program, I had a finance professor. We were going to be talking about corporate cost of capital. He said, before we get into the subject matter, let's talk about personal finances. And let me try and convince you not to get into personal debt as much as possible. He said, there's a reason they call a debt instrument a bond. Because when you get into debt, you put yourself into bondage, and you don't want to get in that position. I actually took that to heart. And I wish more people would kind of take a look at the real dangers of debt. Now, listen, I'm all for home mortgages, that type of thing. We had a great tour yesterday of the ACTS program and some houses right there where you're taking lower income individuals, people really struggling, paying $500, $600, $700 a month for rent, and recovering, salvaging these vacant homes for a fraction of that. So now their cost of a mortgage, what they're paying on a monthly basis is half of what they're paying for rent. And now you've salvaged a home. You've given people ownership. It's a great program, totally private sector, no government funding whatsoever of it.
In that story we had today on the housing program that you mentioned, it was clear that you are not a big fan of the low-income housing tax credit that underlies a lot of what the government does now.
I think you're kind of misstating what my thoughts were on that. Because we talked to, I can't remember her name, but she was part of the Wisconsin Housing Authority, And again, well-intentioned, doing good work. And then, by the way, I won't tell which board member, one of the board members, because I was asking the question. I was just asking a legitimate question. When you've got these housing credits that by and large are basically sold off, I don't know the exact details, I don't know the exact amounts, but what's happening in relationship to the ACTS program, the way the dollars that I was told, basically these homes are bought for about $3,500. And then somewhere between $15,000 and $30,000 is put into these homes to rehabilitate them. And they're more than livable. I mean, we went into 2 of the homes that had already been recovered, went into one that before recovery, and for the amount of money they spent, I mean, this is a nice piece of property now, something that a homeowner can be proud of. But you're talking about less, somewhere around $30,000 being put into that home. Now you get federal credits coming in there. What's happening is the developers, because it's in their they're incentivized to do so, are putting a whole lot more into those homes. So they're taking a $3,500 home potentially and maybe putting, again, I don't know the numbers, so I'm just asking the question. Are we making in that program, because we're putting so many more dollars into it, are we making that basically an uneconomic situation? So I was just asking the question. Obviously, from my standpoint, I prefer a total private sector, market-driven solution, and the ACTS organization is doing so, and it's being successful. So they've done, I think, 500 homes already.
Are you saying you'd eliminate the federal role?
No, what I'm saying is we really need to take a look and understand the root cause, really find out, is the federal, those home subsidy credits, are those harming a private sector system that's working, that's keeping this housing affordable? I mean, what you don't want to do is, in the end, have a house that you poured maybe $100,000 into it. Now, for a low-income family, they're not getting any benefit whatsoever. What they'll need is probably some kind of rent or mortgage assistance to afford the home, when, without any government involvement, we've already got 500 homes, 500 families in homes, and they've literally cut their rent, the cost of housing, in half or more. To me, that's a phenomenal success. Let's make sure that the government, with all the best of intentions, doesn't have, yet again, a very negative unintended consequence, like I'd say student loans.
So
yeah, well-intentioned, but very negative unintended consequences, and that's what I'm talking about across the board in all these well-intentioned government programs. I think the federal government is a $3.5 trillion massive entity, almost all of it well-intentioned, but it does a great deal of harm to ordinary people. So a lot of negative unintended consequences.
I want to return to the politics in Washington for a minute. Last week we had an example again of fractiousness, infighting inside your own party in the House over immigration, where some members of the House were essentially told by a couple of U.S. senators to abandon their leadership. What do you make of what's going on in your own party, not only about immigration, but on some of the issues where there's a lot of internal debate right now?
Well, for my part, I've really been trying to push a unified approach, a strategic approach. Recognizing...
What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, I come from the business world, so I've done a lot of strategic planning, and strategic planning is all about recognizing reality. That's what a SWOT analysis is: strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats. Starting there, and then based on reality, set yourself achievable goals. And don't set yourself up for failure, set yourself up for success. And then once you have those achievable goals, it's a lot easier designing strategies to get there. So we've had 3 hearings. Let's veer into the real humanitarian crisis on our border with children.
Yeah.
We've had 3 hearings. I participated in 3 hearings, 2 in Homeland Security, 1 in Foreign Relations. And it's obvious to me that this administration has misdiagnosed the goal. What's achievable? Because I've asked them point blank, specifically, what is the achievable goal that our policy should be directed at? And I would get things like, well, we got to end the drug violence, end the gang violence. We got to really improve the economies of Central America. Well, we've been trying to do that. I'm not saying that those aren't laudable goals, but are they achievable in the short term? Is it going to solve the problem? No. We've spent more than $75 billion the last 3 years fighting drugs. Still a problem. We've spent almost $1 billion, and it's $976 million down in Central America in those three specific countries over the last 3 years. Hasn't exactly stopped the flow. What we need to, and by the way, that's the goal. The achievable goal should be to stop the flow. The way you accomplish that goal is end the incentives for illegal immigration. That's always been my position. Mm-hmm. The way you secure the border is eliminate the incentives. Let me tell you the incentives that are out there. certainly deferred action on childhood admissions. You know, the human trafficking law with the Feinstein Amendment lengthened the adjudication process. That's part of the problem, okay? But I hate to call that really an incentive. It's just, you know, we certainly haven't been able to send children back to deter parents from sending them on a pretty perilous journey on something called the beast. But specifically, I think the one proximate cause of the childhood issue really was deferred action on childhood admissions, which, you know, I realize the letter of that memorandum does not cover these children, but that's not what parents in Central America are hearing. And by the way, the reality of the situation is if you do get into America, you're pretty well home free as a child. And that's what's happening. Of the people that came in last year, only 2.3% were returned to their home country. So that's an incentive. The Senate Comprehensive Immigration Bill, one of the reasons I voted against it was it included about $260 billion of welfare benefits for non-U.S. citizens. That's an incentive for trying to get in this country. It did offer a path for citizenship to illegal immigrants. That would be another incentive. So what you have to do first and foremost, if you want to solve the immigration problem, is you have to secure the border first by eliminating all those incentives. You'll do other things. Have a very well-functioning guest worker program. Now, I'm opposed to overall minimum wage, except in that instance. I'm happy to impose a minimum wage on a guest worker program to make sure that we're not incentivizing employers to bring in immigrants to lower American wages. So there are things we can do, but you have to identify the problem, really what caused this, identify an achievable goal, and design your policies to achieve that goal, and we're not doing that right now. Right now we're just going to throw money at the problem. We're dispersing kids around America. We are not doing, I do not believe, I haven't heard, and I think if we were doing it, I would have heard this because we've asked the question, adequate health care screening. Let's face it, we've got drug-resistant strains of tuberculosis right now. We're dispersing these kids around America. We're sending a powerful signal that those human traffickers, those evil people, telling these parents and enticing them to spend a year's worth of salary, that they're taking a legitimate risk, because if they get their kids in America, they will be able to stay. We've got to change that calculus.
But as to the politics of it, your own party can't agree on what to do. That was evident last week. What do you make of that?
In the end, they did.
Well,
it's not a perfect process.
Okay.
It's a messy process, but the House, once again, actually passed a bill. Let's not forget that. The Senate didn't. The Senate didn't pass a bill. And largely because Harry Reid, once again, would not allow any amendments where those of us that want to fix the problem could actually have input into what that final bill would be. Offering amendments that probably would get passed because they would improve the bill, but maybe they wouldn't be politically advantageous for the Democrats. That's why Harry Reid has shut down the Senate. It's because he doesn't want to have any of his Democrat senators, his colleagues, to take tough votes. Well, I'm sorry, that's the job of a U.S. Senator. Any member of Congress is to vote as part of that debate. And Harry Reid's not allowing that. So again, I just have to dispute. The House did pass something that I think made sense. It was $659 million paid for. In other words, they reduced spending in lower priority areas. That's what we need to do when we're looking at deficits could be $127 trillion in the next 30 years. And they also prevented further deferred action being taken that create the incentive for more illegal immigration. So, is it the perfect bill is the one I'd write? Probably not. I might do something a little bit different, but at least the House passed something, and Harry Reid wasn't willing to stick around. Yeah, Harry Reid calls me back to the Senate. I'll be back there in a couple hours. But he's not going to do that because he's playing politics with this issue, which is a real shame. There's not a whole lot of compassion playing politics with kids at the border.
What do you think should be done with the children who are here now?
Well, we need to treat them in a safe and humane fashion, but what we really have to do is, again, the achievable goal is stop the flow. How do you stop the flow? Where you have to deter parents from making, I think, a terrible decision of spending a year's worth of salary and subject their children to that horrifically dangerous journey. And the only way I can see deterring that is send the kids back to the home country, which, again, keep in mind, they were just there a couple weeks ago. Okay? And I know you hear things like we're sending them back to certain death. Did you realize in 2012 the murder rate in Detroit and New Orleans was over 50 per 100,000, which was actually higher than the current murder rate in either El Salvador or Honduras, not Honduras, but Guatemala? Okay, so I mean, again, there's a lot of political demagoguery, and I'm just looking at what would potentially work just heard a news story, and I don't know the specifics on this, but they were talking about Australia that had a pretty significant illegal immigration problem too, until a new government came in and said, no, we're going to end it. We're going to secure our border. We're going to send the boat people. We're going to take them again safely, return to their country of origin, and their illegal immigration problem apparently seems to have been reduced dramatically. We need to do the same thing here. There are hundreds of millions, if not literally billions of people that would love to come to America because it is the greatest nation in the history of mankind. We can't have them all come here. We're a nation of laws. We have to secure our border. It is a top priority of the federal government. Secure the border. I'm for a functioning legal immigration system. I'm for a robust guest worker system. I want to solve this problem. But this is not solving the problem. This is just going to exacerbate it. If President Obama, again, I would argue without legal authority, defers action on a few million more people, again, if you're in Central America, wouldn't you take that as a signal and go, well, I just got to get there? And by the way, there's going to be benefits for me, and I'm going to get to America because who doesn't want to be in America? We can't afford that as a nation.
So you were elected in a non-presidential year in Wisconsin. In non-presidential years, Wisconsin tends to lean to the right. You're going to be running for re-election in a presidential year, and Wisconsin has leaned very strongly toward Democrats in presidential years. What are you going to do to try to reach out to those voters, mainly a lot of voters from Milwaukee, from the city of Milwaukee? What are you going to try to do to reach out to those people in this election as opposed to the last one? And on top of that, I'm always surprised with the Marquette poll and some of the other polls, how few people in Wisconsin actually know who you are or have an opinion about you. What are you going to do about those two issues, reaching out to people who just vote in presidential years? And then two, why is it that a lot of people in Wisconsin don't seem to know who you are?
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is continue as best I can to tell them the truth. I made two primary promises during my election. I'll always tell you the truth to the best of my ability. And by the way, I truly appreciate PolitiFact. I want to be PolitiFact checked all the time. I always want to be 100% accurate. And I've made some slip-ups and admitted it immediately, because all I want to convey is accurate information. I want to tell people the truth. I want people to acknowledge the truth. And we're not doing that. So I'll tell them the truth, and I'll never vote my re-election in mind. So I'm going to continue to be who I always said I was going to be, and who I am being. So I'm honoring those promises. I'll continue to do that. I think the solution starts and ends with information. So that, again, I got my charts and graphs. I'm trying to provide information here. It's what I primarily do. So I'm going to continue to do that. I mean, let me tell you, a typical Friday, not every Friday, but a typical Friday for me is I wake up 4:30 Eastern Time, 3:30 Central, hop the first flight back to Milwaukee. We figure out which area of the state, try and get to a high school, try and get to a business or two, try and get to as many events where I can get my PowerPoint presentation, lay out the facts, the figures, make the case, and try and get home by 10 o'clock at night. I mean, that's what I'm doing, and I'm going to continue to do that. I'm going to continue to show the citizens of Wisconsin, here's the problem. Certainly as I view it, here's the facts, here's the figures, here's the root cause of the problem. And I would argue it literally is the size of the federal government. I mean, here's the disconnect, and I think this is part of the message too, is you have what I've seen the opinion polls, 7% approval rating in Congress. First of all, I always add that's too high. But what it also is I think the justified evaluation of the American public of Washington, of the federal government. They're right. The federal government is dysfunctional. It is inefficient. It is ineffective. It is broken. So stop growing it. Wisconsin has in the United States Senator someone who is dedicated to recognizing the reality of the situation, telling the truth, be willing to vote for tough solutions. Now that dealing with a $127 trillion 30-year deficit is not going to be a fun or easy thing to do. The last thing we need in office are people that only care about the re-election. That's not why I'm there. I'm there to solve the problem. So that's what I'll be trying to do over the next couple of years, is convey the extent of the problem, get more Americans to understand it, admit we have a problem so they're actually ready for solutions.
So the answer is you're not going to do anything different, right? To increase the visibility and to reach out to voters who didn't vote in the last election.
Well, again, I think that you continue with what I think will work. Maybe it won't. It'll be the grand experiment. Will the voters of Wisconsin value somebody who's willing to tell them the truth? Not worry about the re-election. Be willing to vote for solutions. Be pretty focused on the high priority things, not get involved in a lot of the nonsense. I guess it'll be the grand experiment. But obviously, when this election in 2014 is over, now I'm in cycle. So now you start doing a little bit more from a standpoint of campaigning. But I mean, my message isn't going to change. People ask. I've had the question asked to me. Well, how's your message changed from this group versus that? Well, it doesn't. First of all, I listen a fair amount. I go in yesterday to ACTS, and I listened, and I asked a lot of questions. It was intriguing. The more I heard, the more I liked. The more I want to promote it, which is why I so appreciate that Don Walker showed up and then highlighted and had an article. More people need to understand that in the inner city, that they can cut their rent by half by taking ownership in one of these homes. They can turn it into their own home. That's a really powerful thing that will really help improve and heal communities. So it's about conveying information. The solution starts and ends with information. And the second part of your question just conveys what a challenge we really have. We have, not just me. We. It's not exactly like I've hidden. I don't get on national TV. I don't get on all the radio talk shows because I like listening to myself talk. Although you may not believe that statement. Listen to me blather on here. I'm getting on to provide information. I'm getting on to provide a perspective, to try and inform, persuade, win the argument. That's why I'm doing these things. I'm not going to stop. I'll try and do it in a more robust fashion. We've gotten better at it. I'm getting way beyond just talk radio. I'm getting into country western stations, Christian stations, normal farm stations, that type of thing, and just having the conversations. And I think that's what's required, because we don't have people, and God bless them, people are so disgusted with Washington, D.C., they don't want to look at it. They don't want it. They just don't want to pay attention. But the problem is we're at a point in time in this country where people have to pay attention.
So two of the candidates who've been discussed as potential challenges for you, one is Russ Feingold, who you ran against before, and Ron Kine. Would you like, of those two, who would you like to run against?
Well, either way, it's going to be the same race. I'll be asking the same question. I'll be trying to point out the disconnect between Americans' disgust for the federal government, where you got 90-some% of the American population that are just thoroughly disgust with the federal government, but you still have people that literally are electing politicians that are dedicated to growing that dysfunctional place. I mean, to me, that makes no sense. There's a real intellectual disconnect there. So I want to point out that disconnect. I really want to point out to the citizens of Wisconsin that it doesn't make any sense to continue to elect people like Ron Kine or Russ Feingold, individuals that literally are dedicated to growing the federal government, people that really think they're so smart that they can go to Washington and they can pass a health care bill that totally remakes our health care system. I would say totally screws it up. I mean, we'll see how this all works out. It's not going to be pretty. Okay. Why do you continue to elect people with that level of arrogance that they really think they've got the solutions to solve everybody's problems? I mean, take a look at what's happened in this country. We've spent, since the mid-'60s, $16 trillion on war and poverty. $16 trillion. Now, it's just slightly less than our total national debt, the debt burden we're going to pass on to our kids and grandkids. And then ask yourself a question. Did it work? You want to know what my campaign theme is for 2015, 2016? Get informed and start thinking. I'm asking people to think. I'll give them information, I'll try and tell them the truth, and then all I'm asking, you don't necessarily agree with me, but boy, please think. Does it really make any sense to keep growing that dysfunctional place? Do you really think there are people smart enough to control your life, or do you maybe want some of that power back? Do you really think maybe the founders were pretty smart when they designed a system really based on state power, individual liberty?
Was Iraq a waste of money too?
Pardon? Was
Iraq a waste of money, the war?
I wasn't there. I didn't vote for it. I wasn't part of that process. I certainly understand how I felt after 9/11, after the anthrax scare, how it was not a pleasant thought that somebody like Saddam Hussein and his sons, who were evil, evil people,
You go back
Hang on here, hang on.
War and poverty, people look at it the same way.
Can you imagine, and by the way, it was, again, I wasn't there, I didn't see the intelligence, but it was pretty universally accepted and agreed on by the world intelligence community that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons facilities. I mean, they just overrun one of his old ones. It was really old. The chemicals are old, but he had them. He had some nuclear programs. Was it as robust as everybody thought? Again, you can say that was incorrect decision. But I'll tell you what, it was a pretty scary thought that Saddam Hussein might have had a nuclear program, might have had chemical weapons, and those weapons could have fallen in the hands of people like Osama bin Laden and his allies in Al-Qaeda. It was a pretty scary time. The chief function of the President of the United States, from the standpoint of national security, is to keep this nation safe. And George Bush made a decision. Now, what I will say, because I hear it all the time, well, that's what caused the deficit. It was part of it, but not the primary part. Since 2001, since 9/11, really about 2002 when we went to war, we've spent specifically, when you take a look at CBO numbers, about a little more than $1.5 trillion on those two wars. I've heard other estimates of $2 trillion. Now, since that time, our debt has grown far more than that. Just since President Obama took office, we've grown debt by about $7 trillion. So again, $2 trillion of our $17 trillion worth of debt, you can say, is part of the war. But what makes up the rest? Well, it's all the other parts of government that aren't particularly working too well.
So to get this debt under control, would you be more in the camp of Rand Paul, of being much more cautious, spending money overseas on wars?
I think we always need to be cautious, but we also need to not be penny wise and pound foolish. We're seeing the results when America withdraws from the world. It's not pretty. I think it was a historic and strategic blunder. Probably the worst mistake President Obama made was not leaving, like we did in Germany and Japan and South Korea, a stabilizing force. Had we done that, I think two situations would be vastly better. I don't think you would have seen Syria spin as far out of control as it's gotten because Iran has been the primary sponsor. All the overflights supplying Iran would not have happened because we would have been based there. We would not have allowed it. And we wouldn't be seeing what the Wall Street Journal has basically dubbed the establishment of the state of Al-Qaedistan. These are troubling times. These are dangerous times.
What about all
and again, and so we've seen was as America withdraws from the world, it doesn't become a more secure place, which threatens our own national security, it threatens our own prosperity.
Even all the military spending bases in Europe and the money we spend in Germany?
Listen, I'm not going to say that the federal government in any aspect, including in the Defense Department, that we spend money very effectively and very efficiently. But it's a top priority government. I think 8 of the 17 enumerated powers about the nation's defense, we should be concentrating on the things the federal government should be doing and the things that the states were empowered to do. We should devolve power over time back to the states. That includes the taxing authority and everything. We should really recognize its individual liberty. It's a system of federalism where government is close to the governed, where it's more accountable, more under control. I mean, we outsource compassion. Hasn't worked too good in the war on poverty. $16 trillion and poverty rates are basically where they were shortly after we engaged in that, about 15%. Number of people in poverty have increased. I wish it had worked. It hasn't. So we have to, again, I'm just asking people to look at the facts. What's worked, what hasn't worked, what will work in the future. And from my standpoint, what works is government close to government where it's more accountable. And I'm getting Pat.
I just want to circle back to one quick thing.
One more question.
Okay, and that is, 4 years ago, you put out an idea at an editorial board meeting that no one picked up on, and it sounds like you're still coming back to it, which is you thought that there should be a limit on how long legislation should be. You said a bill shouldn't be more than 10 pages long, and you're criticizing this comprehensive legislation stuff. Do you still believe that there should be a limit on how long a bill in Congress should be?
Well, I don't know. I do a page limit, but I would really like to see individual issues addressed individually. I mean, the most recent example, this supplemental spending bill that was really primarily about addressing the border, but they also threw Iron Dome on there. They also threw fire suppression. Now, in the end, the Iron Dome was so important that just, it actually was split out of the bill and passed the way it should have been passed as a separate bill that had obviously overwhelming support because nobody even voted on it. It just passed with unanimous consent. we'd be far better off. In the state of Wyoming, having talked to Mike Enzi and John Barrasso, they have a law in the state of Wyoming, single-issue bills. In other words, we don't take a farm bill and turn it into a food stamp bill by having 80% of the spending on that bill be food stamp, but still called a farm bill.
But you'd like to see that in Congress?
Yeah, I'd love to see us address individual issues with individual bills that get full debate, that go through committee process. You would have, I think, a far more functioning, far more collegial Congress. I think we'd get far more done. But we're not allowed to vote on individual pieces of legislation. They stick them all together, and most things that you have to vote yes on, you're just holding your nose because they've junked it up with so many very unappealing things. Again, a lot of it's to garner votes, but let's actually debate issues individually, let them rise or fall on their own merits. I think we'd be in a far better place in this country if we did it just that way. Again, real debate with real information, and I really ask you to take a look at what I presented here. I'd love to come back and just talk about this, because this is the way to look at things. I mean, we've done a single page income statement of the United States, which in one page, you take all these thick volumes where all this information is kind of buried and moved around. I'm using my accounting skills. This lays out the fiscal situation of America. Social Security, Medicare is the primary drivers of debt and deficit, shows where we get our revenue from, where we get our expenses from. Pretty simple. You never see this in anything in the CBO. This is a good format. You can see that Simpson Bowles, we've already done 81% of it. It's been a messy process, but anybody who says, well, you ought to do Simpson Bowles, well, we largely have. Hasn't really made much of a debt in this deficit. And then I think the last thing we did include, by the way, just a template for solutions, a solutions menu. These aren't my solutions, by the way. These are just things that have been scored. And this is the template for considering, if you started doing some of these things, how much of the $14.6 trillion deficit in Social Security would this solve? And we just kind of laid it out. This is a template for real information, so we have an honest and open discussion with the facts and figures as opposed to the political demagoguery of campaign ads. Got the same thing for Medicare here. Again, all this is illustrative. These are not my solutions. These are somebody else's solutions that have been scored, and I can put it on this template. This is how we have to look at these things. Okay? Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for your time.